The chandeliers glowed like captured waterfalls, 1,000 crystals suspended mid-fall, scattering light across polished marble that looked like it had been carved from the bones of the earth itself. The hall of the six-star Dubai hotel seemed less like a place where people gathered to eat and more like a theater where power rehearsed its performance every night. The air itself carried weight, humming with languages, laughter, and the quiet confidence of men and women who believed the world bent at their will. Waiters moved like shadows across the floor, their footsteps absorbed by the thick Persian rugs. Strings played faintly in the background, the music just enough to remind the room of refinement, yet low enough not to compete with the chatter of billionaires, politicians, and diplomats. At the center of the grand hall, Graham Ford commanded attention without even speaking. His presence radiated the arrogance of someone who had built empires by breaking men twice his size. A tall figure in a steel gray suit, hair slicked back, his smile was polished like the edge of a blade, sharp, dangerous, and always ready to cut. He was the kind of man whose laughter could fill a room and silence it in the same breath, the kind of man who could decide the fate of countries over a glass of Bordeaux. Tonight, surrounded by senators, media moguls, and jeweled socialites, he leaned back in his chair like a king among courtiers, his eyes searching the room not for company, but for someone to look down upon. Moving between these tables of power was Sarah Collins. 25 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that no apron could disguise. Her black uniform was pressed neatly, but her shoes betrayed her, a little worn, the soles tired from shifts that stretched longer than the night. Her dark hair was pinned back, a faint scar above her left brow catching the glint of the chandelier whenever she bowed her head. She did not belong to this world of silk gowns and crystal glasses, yet she walked through it as though she had rehearsed the steps 1,000 times, each movement deliberate, graceful, and invisible all at once. To the guests, she was nothing more than service, a hand delivering wine, a shadow replacing plates, a voice kept soft, clipped, professional. Yet inside, Sarah carried storms. She had learned to hide them well, the way her stomach tightened whenever someone's laughter lingered too long on her, the way her chest hardened when she caught the flash of contempt in a stranger's eyes. Tonight, she was covering a shift for a colleague who had called out, hoping the extra hours would help patch holes in her life that never seemed to close. Her phone, tucked deep in the pocket of her apron, vibrated with the cold indifference of technology delivering heartbreak. She slipped it out for the briefest glance between tables, her breath catching when she saw the message. Insurance denied Mom's treatment again. 5 words, short and sharp, fell into her chest like stones dropped in water, rippling through every corner of her being. For a moment, the chandeliers above blurred, the hall's golden light replaced by the image of a frail woman lying in a quiet room across the ocean, fighting for breath that came too shallow, too labored. Sarah slipped the phone back into her pocket, her hand trembling slightly before she forced it steady again. No one at the tables noticed, no one ever noticed. To them she was faceless, nameless, interchangeable. But Sarah noticed them. Every gesture, every careless word, every glance dripping with judgment. She noticed the senator with his bow tie slightly askew, laughing too loudly at jokes meant to sting. She noticed the pearl-strung woman who raised her glass as though lifting it were a performance of grace. She noticed the media tycoon whispering to Graham Ford, their eyes flicking toward her like hunters spotting prey. Sarah inhaled slowly, carefully, remembering her mentor's voice, Professor Yusuf Al-Hassan, who had once told her, "Breathe before you speak. Words are power, and power begins with control." She exhaled through her nose, steadying the storm inside her chest. And so she continued, placing a glass on a linen-draped table, straightening cutlery with invisible precision, carrying herself as though the weight of the hall's arrogance could not press her down. What she did not yet know, what none of them knew, was that before this night was over, the storm inside her would not only be seen, it would be heard, and when it broke loose, it would leave even Graham Ford speechless. The music drifted like smoke, soft and elegant, but beneath it the voices cut sharper than glass. At every table, words dressed as jokes floated through the air, but each one carried a sting, a barb hidden in velvet. Sarah carried her tray through the gleaming hall, the soles of her worn shoes whispering against the marble. She could feel eyes following her, not the kind of eyes that see you, but the kind that measure you, searching for cracks they can laugh at. As she leaned to pour a glass of wine, the first whisper came from her left. A man's voice, oily with false amusement. "They're really pushing diversity tonight." A soft giggle answered, a woman's voice sharp as glass. "Don't be sensitive. It's only a joke." The laughter lingered a beat too long, the kind that isn't meant to be funny, but to remind you where they think you belong. Sarah didn't look up. Her hands were steady, pouring deep red into crystal, the surface trembling but not spilling. Inside, though, her stomach clenched. She had heard it all before. The comments that were never meant to be direct but always meant to cut. The kind that slid off like oil but left a trace, a slick of something you couldn't wash away. She bowed her head slightly, stepping back, the tray balanced perfectly against her palm. A woman in fur walked past, clutch pulled closer as though Sarah might snatch it. The gesture was small, barely noticeable, but Sarah saw it. She always saw it. Each tiny movement was like another stone added to the weight she carried. The security guard at the door had already given her that slow, deliberate pause when he scanned her badge earlier, as if deciding whether she belonged here. Now, even in the middle of chandeliers and velvet gowns, she still felt the same question pressing against her. Do you deserve to stand here? The senator at Graham's table let out a booming laugh, whiskey heavy in his throat. "Shoes look thrift store," he muttered, just low enough for the people near him to hear, just loud enough for Sarah to catch it. Clara Price, pearls shimmering at her neck, tilted her chin. "If the hotel insists on these diversity hires," she said sweetly, "at least they could afford better uniforms." The laughter pricked like static. Sarah lowered her eyes, but inside a tightness wound itself around her chest. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. She didn't need to read it. She already knew the kind of message it carried. Bills. Denials. More doors closed in her mother's face. She pressed her lips together, steadying her breath, and remembered her mentor. "Breathe before you speak. Words are power." The phrase rose in her mind like a lifeline. She inhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate, and let the breath anchor her. She turned slightly, catching her reflection in the polished marble floor. For a moment, she didn't see the apron or the shoes. She saw her mother, 3 jobs, tired hands, the woman who had taught her never to let shame bow her spine. That thought alone kept her standing tall as she moved to the next table, ignoring the mutters that followed her like shadows. But across the hall, Graham Ford's gaze had already fixed on her. His smile curled with the promise of cruelty, his voice ready to strike, and in seconds the whispers would turn into something louder, sharper, and more dangerous. The night was only beginning, and Sarah didn't know it yet, but the words that had always been used to diminish her were about to become the very weapon that set her free. The first thing she noticed at table 1 was the heat coming off the laughter. Not the sound of it, the heat. It radiated from the cluster of men and women like the warmth from a stove that has been left on too long. The senator's bow tie had shifted to one side, his eyes bright with whiskey. Clara Price's pearls pooled at the hollow of her neck like a small glacier, cold and deliberate. A media man with slicked hair leaned back, chin up, a fox who thought he owned the henhouse. And at the head sat Graham Ford, one sleeve folded back an inch to show a watch as dark and serious as an oath. He held his wine as though it had been trained to behave. Sarah approached with the bottle balanced on her palm, the other hand steadying the base as she had been taught. The glass at Graham's right caught the chandelier's light and threw it across the linen in thin blades. Her reflection trembled in the crystal, a quick flicker, then settled when she steadied her breath. She tipped the bottle. Bordeaux slipped out in a thin ribbon, soft as velvet. Graham leaned toward his guests, the corners of his mouth rising with lazy amusement. He did not lower his voice. He switched languages as if slipping into a more expensive coat. Arabic, smooth and deliberate, poured from him the way oil pours, dark, controlled, and meant to spread. "A lowly creature like her dares touch my crystal glass," he said, and the table cracked with laughter. The sound struck like hail, sharp, cold, unmistakable. Someone rapped a spoon against a plate as if to ring in the cruelty. A woman in a yellow dress covered her grin with two fingers, pretending restraint while enjoying the show. The senator coughed out a choked, "Good one," then sniffed, smug and satisfied. Another guest shook his head with mock pity. "She's brave," he said, "or doesn't know better." The wine in Sarah's hand trembled once, then leveled. She did not spill, she did not gasp. The old training rose up through her spine. Breathe before you speak. Words are power. Control is the first word you say. She set the bottle down so softly the glass barely whispered. She felt her heart pound against her ribs, steady as a drum calling troops to the field, and beneath it, the ache of her mother's message pulsing like an old wound. Insurance denied. The two worlds collided inside her, one made of chandeliers, marble, and arrogance, the other made of hospital rooms, paper forms, and a cough that would not let go. No one at the table expected anything from her except silence. Silence was the part assigned to her. Silence had been baked into the linen, folded into the napkins printed on the menu. The guards at the door wore it on their faces. The manager backstage carried it like a policy. The guests believed silence was the electricity that kept the hall bright. Sarah's breath strayed, then came back under her command. She lifted her chin. Only a little. Only enough to break the posture of obedience that told them she was not there to speak. She let her eyes meet Graham's for a fraction, then moved them over the table, counting forks, counting glasses, letting her mind map the details so it would not drown in the insult. She could smell sandalwood and Bordeaux, and something underneath both. Fear dressed as confidence. Tourist phrases, Clara murmured, half bored, half delighted by the thought of catching a fly in a jar. If she knows anything, it's the pleasantries. The media man narrowed his gaze as though zooming in. She won't make a sound, he said, with the certainty of a man who had spent his life narrating other people's silence. Sarah felt the old scar above her brow tighten a little, the skin pulling as memory brushed it with a fingertip. She thought of Professor Yusuf al-Hassan in his worn tweed jacket, chalk dust on his sleeves, telling her that language builds rooms inside the mind. Some rooms shelter, some rooms trap. Breathe, choose the door, walk through it when the moment opens. A gloved hand brushed past her hip. The floor manager. He did not look at her. He looked through her, toward the table, eyes asking a question he did not dare speak. Keep moving. Keep quiet. Sarah met Maya's glance across the aisle. Her coworker paused, the bread basket held like an offering. A small nod. I'm here. Graham lifted his glass and examined the wine with serene contempt, as if searching for a flaw in the way it caught the light. He set the rim against his lower lip without drinking, then pulled it away as if it had failed him. Even crystal, he said in English this time for everyone to hear, can be lowered by the wrong hands. Another laugh tilted the table. The sound was so practiced it could have been a song they rehearsed every night. A waiter passing behind Sarah slowed, perhaps to listen, perhaps to help, then kept going. The strings in the corner floated a quiet phrase, as if embarrassed to be playing at all. Sarah's throat tightened, but not with tears, with focus. The body makes reporters of the eyes and ears when the heart is in danger, and hers now reported everything, the clink of a cufflink against a plate, the sniff of the senator's cologne, the quick, bright intake of breath from a young woman, Graham's daughter, she realized, whose fingers were tearing a napkin under the table. Not everyone here was proud of what was happening. That mattered. Not much, but enough to keep the ground from feeling entirely tilted. The insult hung in the air like a banner. It wanted her to kneel beneath it. It wanted her to make herself smaller so it could feel big. She let it hang. She did not kneel. She placed the bottle on the side stand, set the stopper with a neat twist, and squared the cloth as if preparing a stage. Inside her chest, a door opened. She felt it as a click, a simple mechanical truth. The hinge found its groove. The heat of the laughter receded a degree. The chandelier stopped flickering in her peripheral vision and settled into a steady blaze. She could hear her mother's voice folded inside her mentor's. Do not let shame teach you to whisper. Speak when your words can stand. Across the table, the ambassador's pen paused over her small notebook. Dr. Hale's eyes, kindly and keen, rose a fraction, curious. The security guard by the entrance shifted his weight, sensing weather change but not yet sure from which direction it would arrive. The hall, for a single heartbeat, seemed to lean forward. Sarah lifted her gaze fully at last, not defiant, not pleading, simply ready. She could taste the next moment, metallic and electric, like the air before a storm. She placed one hand on the back of the empty chair beside her, the other lightly on the tray, grounding herself. When she spoke, it would not be loud, it would not need to be. The room, trained to listen only to money, was about to learn a different kind of attention. She drew breath, slow, clean, unshaken, and let the silence recognize her. The silence had weight. It pressed against the walls, rolled across the marble, and pinned every guest in place. A fork chimed faintly against porcelain as someone shifted too quickly, and the sound carried through the entire hall like a bell tolling in a cathedral. Sarah stood very still, one hand on the silver tray, the other brushing the cloth edge of an empty chair. Her eyes were calm, her shoulders square, and when she spoke, the words slipped into the air like a blade sliding out of its sheath. "The crystal glass," she said in Arabic, her voice smooth, deliberate, and soft enough that people had to lean forward to catch it, "does not lower the one who holds it. It only reflects the dignity of the one who drinks from it." The words landed like stones dropped in still water. Ripples spread instantly. Senator Brooks blinked, mouth hanging open mid-smirk. Clara Price's painted lips froze, half a smile too long. The media mogul's hand, raised to adjust his cufflinks, stopped in midair, and Graham Ford's steel-gray eyes snapped toward her, sharp as knives, the arrogance in his smirk faltering. For a single second, no one breathed. Even the chandeliers seemed to still, their crystals catching light in hushed reverence. Then came the first whisper, like a wind sneaking through the cracks of a closed door. "She understands Arabic." The voice belonged to Ambassador Lydia Grant, her diplomat's poise faltering just enough for awe to leak through. Her pen lowered onto her lap. Across the table, Isa Ford, Graham's 22-year-old daughter, looked at Sarah as though she had just seen a cage door swing open. The young woman's eyes glimmered, her nasen, pecan clenched between her fingers, no longer torn but held still. The table that had moments ago roared with laughter now sat frozen in an invisible grip. Every guest who had joined in the cruelty now found themselves marked by their own silence. The arrogance had cracked, but power hates being caught. Clara Price recovered first, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Tourist phrases," she said with a dismissive wave, her pearls rattling faintly. "Anyone can pick up a line or two when they travel." Nick Harper, the slick-haired mogul, jumped quickly to her side, his words cutting. "Exactly. Mimicry. It doesn't mean she truly understands. Parrots can be trained to talk too." He smirked, satisfied with his cruelty. A few chuckles rose again, uneasy, not confident this time. The room wanted to return to safety, to the hierarchy they had always known. Senator Brooks leaned back, voice heavy with condescension. "Don't be too impressed. Words aren't worth much if they can't be tested." And then Evelyn Ward, the woman in the yellow gown, struck her fork against her glass with a sharp ting-ting-ting. The sound echoed like a challenge, her lips curved into a smile that wasn't kind. "Let's have some fun," she said. "Say something impressive. Or are you just a one-trick pony?" Laughter followed her, but it wasn't full. It was cautious, like animals testing a trap before stepping inside. The earlier arrogance was gone. Now, there was suspicion. What if this young waitress had more to her than they had assumed? Sarah didn't move at once. She let the silence stretch just long enough to remind them that she was choosing the moment. Her hand pressed gently against the edge of the silver tray, as if steadying a baton before raising it. She thought of her mother, lying alone in a hospital room across the ocean, her breath labored but her spirit unbroken. She thought of Profe, Sor Youssef Al-Hassan, who had told her that words, when chosen with precision, could shift the weight of a room more surely than any fortune. When she finally spoke, it was not with fire, but with a quiet thread of sound that wove through the hall like music. "All right," Sarah said, her English soft but carrying. If you want to listen, then I'll let the words speak. The air changed. You could feel it. Ambassador Grant set her notebook down completely. Dr. Thomas Hale, the scholar, leaned forward, hunger in his eyes like a man about to witness something rare. Issa's chest rose, then held still, as though she had forgotten to breathe. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from the weight in her pocket, the folded envelope she always carried, her paper heartbeat. Then she opened them again, her gaze calm, her voice steady, her Arabic about to cut through the marble and crystal, not as a servant's voice, but as something far more dangerous, truth spoken with dignity. The room, which had mocked her as invisible, was now caught in her rhythm. They didn't know it yet, but the game they thought they controlled was already slipping out of their hands. The yellow-gowned woman's fork fell silent, the ting still ringing in the air like a dare. Around the table, eyes shifted, their hunger for spectacle suddenly sharpened. They wanted her to stumble. They wanted to see the brief flicker of courage in a waitress extinguished under the weight of their laughter. The trap was set. Sarah did not rush. She rested the tray lightly on the linen-covered side table, her fingers smoothing the cloth as if preparing her own stage. She inhaled, held the breath for a steady moment, and let it out slowly. Her mother's voice stirred within her memory. "Don't let them steal your dinner with politeness, daughter." And then came her mentor's wisdom. "Words are power. Breathe before you use them." Both voices wrapped around her like invisible armor. When she lifted her gaze, the laughter hushed. Even those smiling in anticipation felt a shift they couldn't name. Sarah pressed one palm against the silver tray's rim, as though lifting a conductor's baton, and then she began. Not loudly, but with a cadence that struck directly at the human instinct to listen. The Arabic fell from her lips like water over stone, steady, smooth, unhurried. She recited Al-Mutanabi, not like a student parroting lines, but like a soul carrying music it had lived inside. Each consonant curved with intention, each vowel stretched with precision. Pauses fell in perfect rhythm, the silences between words as commanding as the words themselves. The air in the hall shifted. It was as though the chandeliers leaned closer, crystals trembling faintly with the sound. The clink of cutlery in a far corner seemed too loud, an intrusion in a sacred moment. Conversations faded into stillness as other tables turned their heads. Dr. Thomas Hale nearly dropped his fork. His gray brows shot upward, his scholar's mind stunned. "Extraordinary," he whispered, then lowered his voice as if speaking to himself. Not recitation, lived intonation, classical cadence, imagery intact. His astonishment became a lifeline. Others glanced toward him, seeking confirmation. His nod made Sarah's words undeniable. Graham Ford's smile thinned, his jaw stiffening as if the verses struck him directly. He leaned back, fingers drumming once on the table, forcing a mask of indifference, but his eyes betrayed unease. Senator Brooks had gone oddly silent, his earlier mockery stalled mid-thought. Clara Price's pearls no longer glistened with power. Her fingers fidgeted restlessly, trying to find an anchor. And Isa Ford, young, observant, sat frozen, her eyes fixed on Sarah, her breath caught in her throat. Relief washed over her face, relief that someone had dared to shatter the suffocating pride of the table. Sarah continued, her voice never rising, yet commanding. Every ear. The verses carried dignity, sorrow, triumph, the full architecture of a poet who had once thundered across centuries. And now, through her, those centuries echoed in a hall that had moments ago dismissed her as the help. When she reached the final line, she allowed silence to settle like dust after a storm. Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again. She had not raised her voice. She had not shouted. Yet the silence that followed her was heavier than any applause. The first sound came from Isa, not words, just the faint exhale of someone who had been holding her breath for too long. Then Dr. Hale cleared his throat, his voice breaking the tension. "This," he said firmly, "is no mimicry. This is mastery." The spell cracked. Murmurs began again, uneasy, defensive. Graham forced a smile sharp enough to cut. "Poetry is easy," he said smoothly, his tone sliding back into control. "Eloquence doesn't equal understanding. His eyes cut toward Nick Harper, the media mogul, who straightened instantly. Nick leaned forward, switching to rapid-fire Arabic, his words dense and technical. If you're truly fluent, answer this. Shipping lanes through the strait, tariff routes between trade blocks, volatility spreads last quarter. His tone was smug, labyrinthine, a trap of numbers and jargon meant to expose her. Senator Brooks chuckled, emboldened again. Now we'll see if the parrot sings anything useful. Clara tilted her glass, lips curling. She'll trip. Just watch. But Sarah only tilted her head, her expression thoughtful, as though sketching a map inside her mind. She did not rush. She let his words finish. She let the silence hold. And then, still in Arabic, she began to answer, breaking the complex problem into 3 clear routes, stacking logic like bricks, building a wall too firm to topple. The hall leaned in, unaware that in trying to test her, they had opened the door for her to reveal not just poetry, but power. Nick Harper's words had been fired like a volley of arrows, dense with numbers, freighted with jargon, designed to confuse, to tangle, to prove her out of her depth. The table leaned forward, eager to watch her stumble. Senator Brooks smirked behind his glass of whiskey, already savoring the fall. Clara Price's pearls quivered with her satisfied laugh, quiet but sharp as the edge of glass. Graham Ford folded his arms, sure that the trap would close neatly around the waitress who had dared to speak. Sarah did not answer immediately. She stood still, her head tilted slightly, as though she were sketching a map only she could see. She let the silence stretch. It unnerved them. Their laughter faltered, their smirks shifted uncomfortably, because silence in her hands had turned from weakness into command. Then she spoke, still in Arabic, calm, measured, deliberate. First, she said, the Gulf to Red Sea route. Its efficiency depends on 3 choke points: insurance windows, demand elasticity, and downstream logistics under price shocks. The table shifted. Someone muttered. Senator Brooks blinked, his smugness beginning to crack. Second, Sarah continued, her voice steady as a stone wall, the Mediterranean corridor through transshipment ports. It looks safe at first, but tariffs here create volatility bands, forcing rerouting and exposing systemic risks that ripple into futures markets. The media mogul's smirk faltered. His question had been meant as a labyrinth, not expecting her to walk through it with ease. Yet here she was, drawing lines, connecting dots, turning his snare into a path. And finally, she said, the South Asia detour. Risk appears minimal until you account for insurance variability and second-order effects. What seems safe is actually more vulnerable to shocks because of forced rerouting. Her words stacked neatly, brick by brick, until the wall stood finished, complete, solid, unbreakable. She stopped. No flourish, no extra words. His truth laid bare, simple and irrefutable. The silence afterward was different than before, heavier, not stunned silence, but the silence of people realizing they were in the presence of someone who had just rewritten the rules of the room. Ambassador Grant leaned forward, her face no longer curious but respectful. Extraordinary, she murmured, this time not as an aside but for all to hear. Dr. Hale nodded vigorously, his scholar's eyes alight, his pen scratching furiously as though desperate to capture every phrase. She didn't just answer, he whispered. She dismantled it. Precision, logic, cadence. This is lived expertise. Issa Ford exhaled a long, shaky breath. Her father's fortress had cracked, and she felt a rush of relief she hadn't expected, relief that someone had dared to stand tall against him. The first clap came unexpectedly. Senator Brooks, of all people, set his glass down and began clapping slowly, deliberately. The sound echoed across the hall, each clap louder, more certain. That's not just fluency, he said, his voice stripped of drunken arrogance. That's mastery, that's expertise. Applause spread across the room, hesitant at first, then stronger. Not everyone joined. Clara Price kept her glass in her hand, her lips pressed thin. Nick Harper checked his watch, pretending indifference. Graham Ford's face was carved from stone, his smile stretched too tight, too brittle. But the tide had shifted, and he could not stop it. Still, the old order clung to its last defense, A voice from the back sneered, "She's still the help." The words fell into the air like a stone into water, heavy and cruel. But this time, the echo that followed wasn't laughter. It was shame. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She let the cruelty collapse under its own weight, then said softly, still in Arabic, "Yes, I am a server. And I am also a student of Professor Yusuf Al-Hassan, linguistic advisor to the government." Gasps rippled across the hall. Senator Brooks jolted upright. "Al-Hassan," he said, his voice sober, serious now. "I know him. He only takes the best." Authority had spoken, and suddenly the power of the mockery shrank to nothing. The whispers, the sneers, the microaggressions. They all shriveled in the light of recognition. The hierarchy of the evening had shifted, not because Sarah demanded it, but because she had shown herself greater than the room dared admit. Ambassador Grant set her pen down and folded her hands, her gaze steady. "The order has changed tonight," she said quietly, as if delivering a verdict. And across the table, Issa Ford's eyes glistened, not just with awe, but with gratitude. For the first time, she felt free of the shame that had chained her to her father's arrogance. Sarah lowered her eyes, her hands steady on the tray. She did not smile, she did not gloat, she let her words stand for her, tall and unshaken. The hall had mocked her silence. Now it was their turn to sit inside it. The applause still echoed when Graham Ford leaned back in his chair, his face a mask stretched too thin. His jaw worked once, twice, before he forced a smile that never reached his eyes. The billionaire who had mocked her now sat exposed, but men like Graham did not surrender easily. They had built their fortunes on never allowing anyone else the last word. "Poetry," he said at last, his tone smooth as polished steel, his English slicing into the air, "is easy, and eloquence, even when it impresses, does not equal understanding. It is one thing to recite, it is another to truly know." The words slithered through the hall, an attempt to reduce her triumph to nothing but decoration. His hand tightened around his glass, but his voice stayed steady. He tilted his head toward Nick Harper, who straightened instantly, his slick hair catching the chandelier's light. Nick smirked, eager to restore the hierarchy. Switching back to A. "Rabic." He fired off another challenge, this one quicker, sharper, laced with economic terms and shipping jargon meant to trip her tongue. He rattled figures like bullets, tariffs, volatility spreads, futures markets, the straits, choke points, all strung together in a labyrinth so dense even seasoned policymakers might stumble. It wasn't simply a test, it was a trap. The room leaned forward, the guests craving spectacle again, eager to see her falter after daring to rise so high. Clara Price adjusted her pearls with a satisfied smile, already anticipating the moment Sarah's confidence would collapse. Senator Brooks chuckled low in his throat, muttering, "Now let's see if the parrot still sings." But Sarah didn't move, didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing as though she were sketching the puzzle in her mind. She let the silence stretch just long enough to turn their certainty into unease. She remembered Yusuf Al-Hassan's lessons, his voice in a Cairo classroom. "Don't be tricked by speed. The one who rushes always reveals their weakness. Breathe, break the problem apart, then build it again in your words." She inhaled slowly, and when she spoke, her Arabic carried the calm authority of someone who had already walked the path. "First," she said, "the Gulf to Red Sea route. Its efficiency lies in three variables: insurance thresholds, demand elasticity under price shifts, and second-order effects on downstream logistics." A murmur ran through the hall. "Second," she continued, the Mediterranean corridor. It looks stable, but tariffs here create volatility bands. The basis between exchanges widens, and suddenly what looks safe becomes the weakest link." Nick's smirk faltered. Clara's smile froze. "And third," Sarah finished, "the South Asia detour. It is often seen as low risk, but forced rerouting raises systemic vulnerability. A single shock there becomes a domino through every exchange." She stopped. No flourish, no drama, just the weight of truth. A wall of logic so carefully built, no one could knock it down. Ambassador Lydia Grant leaned back in her chair, her face shifting from curiosity to open respect. Dr. Hale scribbled furiously, nodding after every sentence, his scholar's voice breaking through. Flawless. This isn't memorization. This is mastery. And then the applause returned. But this time it wasn't polite. It was reluctant at first, then inevitable, rolling across the hall like a tide. Senator Brooks, who had mocked her minutes ago, clapped first, slow and deliberate. That's not fluency, he said soberly. That's expertise. Still, resistance clung like smoke. A voice muttered from the end of the table, "She's still the help." The words hung in the air, poisonous but weak. Sarah didn't argue. She let the phrase echo in its own emptiness. Then she lifted her chin, her voice calm, steady. Yes, I serve. And I am also a student of Professor Yusuf Al-Hassan, linguistic advisor to the government. Gasps rippled. Brooks straightened in his chair. Al-Hassan? I know him. He only takes the best. For the first time, Graham's mask slipped. A flicker crossed his face, recognition, then unease. Because he knew what came next. He had forgotten something, and Sarah hadn't. Her hand brushed the edge of her apron pocket where the envelope waited, its paper worn but unbroken. The time was near. The truth she carried on that page was sharper than any insult he could throw, and when she pulled it out, Graham Ford would have no defense left. The applause had not yet faded when Sarah's hand slipped into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed the worn edges of paper she had carried like a hidden heartbeat. For months, she had kept it close, folded so many times that the creases had grown soft, the embossing nearly faded. Tonight, under chandeliers blazing with false brilliance, the letter had waited. Not as a weapon, but as a record. The roots on. M was restless now. Applause had shaken the arrogance but not erased it. Clara Price leaned back in her chair, lips curved in a thin, dismissive smile. Nick Harper tapped his watch, pretending disinterest, though his eyes flicked constantly towards Sarah, searching for cracks. And Graham Ford, the man who had set the entire table against her, sat frozen, his steel gray eyes narrow, his smile tight as glass about to shatter. Sarah drew the envelope slowly, not for cheap drama, but with the reverence of someone unveiling something sacred. The dry rasp of paper against fabric filled the silence like a drumbeat. Conversations faltered. Pearls stilled. A gasp escaped someone's throat. She unfolded the document carefully, the creases sighing open. Her voice when it came was low but clear, carrying across the table and out into the hall. Full honorary scholarship, she read in English, granted to Sarah Collins by the Royal Fellowship for Language and Culture. Murmurs rippled. The air seemed to lean closer. She lifted the page, and the chandelier's light caught the bottom line. Ink bold and undeniable. Board chair, Graham Ford. The name struck the table like a hammer on glass. Faces stiffened. Senator Brooks blinked in disbelief. Ambassador Grant drew in a sharp breath. Dr. Hale set his pen down with a soft thud, whispering, "My God." For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then every eye swung toward Graham. His face betrayed him in flashes. Defense, denial, calculation, shame, all flickering across him like neon signs. His hand twitched as if to reach for the letter, then stopped midway, curling into a fist. Sarah folded the page back, her movements precise, her voice steady. "You signed many such letters," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "You forget, but we do not." The words weren't accusation. They were record, a reminder that paper held longer memory than arrogance. Silence cracked. Brooks was the first to react, his bow tie crooked, his voice rough. He signed it. And he gave her that scholarship? His gaze darted between Sarah and Graham, disbelief sharpening into outrage. Clara Price's pearls trembled against her throat as her hand rose instinctively, hiding her mouth. Nick Harper shifted uneasily, his earlier smugness draining like color from his face. Issa Ford, trembling, half rose from her chair, her hands clasped as if praying for someone to finally say what needed to be said. And then the applause erupted again, this time not polite, not hesitant, but fierce. It began with Maya Lee, Sarah's co-worker, clapping at the side with trembling hands. Then Senator Brooks rose, his hands slamming together with force. Dr. Hale joined, his face alight with respect. The hall filled with thunder, each clap a verdict. But even amid the applause, Sarah didn't smile. She didn't bask. She stood steady, folding the letter once more and slipping it back into her pocket. Her victory was not in humiliation. It was in truth, revealed. Across the table, Graham Ford's empire of arrogance wavered. For years, he had built walls of power with words meant to cut. Tonight, words had turned against him, and for the first time in his reign of polished cruelty, he had nothing left to say. The thunder of applause rolled through the hall, echoing beneath chandeliers that trembled with every clap. For once, Sarah wasn't invisible. For once, the air did not belong to billionaires and senators, but to the truth she had spoken. Maya clapped with tears burning in her eyes. Ambassador Grant's hands came together slowly but firmly, each strike like a seal of approval. Even the drunken senator, who had laughed loudest earlier, now stood half-bowed, his claps deliberate, almost reverent. But in every room where truth rises, shadows cling, and in the lull between claps, the old order tried to breathe again. A voice cut through the noise, low, bitter, meant to drag her back down. She's still the help. The words landed like a cold stone tossed into warm water, rippling silence outward. The applause faltered. Glasses trembled in midair. Some eyes darted away, others shifted uncomfortably, clinging to the last fragile shield of prejudice. Sarah didn't flinch. She let the poison echo in its own emptiness, hanging long enough for everyone to hear how hollow it was. Then she raised her chin, her voice calm, steady, every syllable placed like a brick on solid ground. "Yes," she said in Arabic first, then repeated in English so no one could hide behind language. "I am a server. I serve food. I serve water. Tonight, I served words, and truth is serving you as well, whether you want it or not." Her tone wasn't bitter, wasn't triumphant. It was simply true. And because it was true, it landed heavier than any insult, heavier than any defense Graham or his circle could muster. A hush spread. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Isa Ford, Graham's daughter, rose fully to her feet. She stepped around the table, her heels whispering across the marble, and came to stand beside Sarah. Without performance, without hesitation, she leaned forward and embraced her lightly, just enough to say, "I see you. I'm sorry." Gasps rippled across the hall. Some faces softened with relief, others tightened with resistance. Clara Price pressed her pearls as though they could protect her from change. Nick Harper tapped his phone furiously, already calculating how to spin this moment. Senator Brooks scratched his temple, muttering, "Well, maybe the world's shifting faster than I thought." But the tide was undeniable. The applause returned, softer this time, but warmer. It rose not from spectacle but from respect. For the first time that night, eyes looked at Sarah, not as the help, not as invisible, but as someone who had forced the room to see itself. Graham Ford remained seated, frozen in his steel gray suit. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass until his knuckles whitened. His empire of silence was crumbling, brick by brick, and yet he could not summon an apology. Not yet. His daughter's embrace was salt in his wound, proof that even his own blood recognized the truth he had spent years crushing underfoot. Sarah stepped back half a pace, her posture unshaken. She picked up her tray again, the silver edge catching the chandelier's light. She smoothed the linen beside it as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The gesture was small, ordinary, but in the silence that followed, it became a manifesto. "I do my job, but I do not owe you smallness." The room's gravity had shifted, and Graham Ford knew it. The hall had shifted, its atmosphere dense with something new, an uneasy respect mixed with shame. Yet arrogance never dies easily. Graham Ford sat still, his jaw locked, eyes burning with a cold fire. To him, applause was fickle. He had survived scandals before. He had bought silence, buried truths. Surely this night would pass like all the others. Surely the crowd's memory would blur by morning. But Sarah knew better. She had lived her whole life beneath the weight of people insisting moments like this would pass. And tonight, she was ready. Her hand slipped once more into her apron pocket. The envelope was still there, edges softened from years of being folded and unfolded, corners worn smooth like sea stones. She had carried it not as a trophy but as a reminder of where she had come from and of what had once saved her from falling into the cracks. She drew it out with deliberate calm. The dry whisper of paper against fabric silenced what little chatter remained. Faces turned. Clara Price's pearls trembled again at her throat. Senator Brooks tilted forward, almost drunk on suspense. Ambassador Grant's pen stilled above her notebook, the ink freezing mid-stroke. Sarah opened the letter slowly, carefully, letting the anticipation coil tighter. Then lifting her chin, she read aloud in English so no one could hide behind language. Full honorary scholarship, her voice rang clear. Granted to Sarah Collins by the Royal Fellowship for Language and Culture. Board Chair, Graham Ford. The chandelier light struck the page, igniting the green ink of Graham's signature until it glowed like a wound. The room cracked wide open. "No," Graham muttered, his face pale, but the word had no conviction. His own name betrayed him in bold ink. His eyes darted left, then right as though searching for an escape that wasn't there. His daughter Issa sank back into her chair, tears shining in her eyes, as if she had waited for this truth all along. Dr. Hale whispered with awe, "That's his hand, his signature. I know it." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried like gospel. Senator Brooks, swaying with whiskey and indignation, jabbed a finger toward Graham. You gave her that scholarship? You knew her talent. You endorsed her. And now you—" His words tangled into outrage, cut short by his own disbelief. The applause that followed wasn't hesitant this time. It erupted like a storm breaking a dam. Staff at the edges of the hall joined in. Guests who had whispered jokes earlier now clapped with a desperate eagerness, as if trying to wash themselves clean of complicity. Graham remained seated, his smile gone, his composure shattered. His empire had always been built on power spoken into existence, but now his own signature had spoken against him. Sarah folded the letter gently, not triumphant, not mocking. She slipped it back into her apron pocket with the care of someone sealing a chapter. Then she lifted her gaze, her voice calm but unflinching. "You signed many such letters, Mr. Ford. Perhaps you forgot. But we do not forget. Paper remembers. Words remember. And tonight, so does everyone in this hall." Gasps rippled. Issa covered her face, her shoulders trembling. Ambassador Grant closed her notebook, lips pursed with satisfaction. Dr. Hale nodded, as though witnessing history being etched right before his eyes. Graham opened his mouth, but no words came. He closed it again, defeated by the weight of his own ink. For the first time in his gilded career, silence was no longer his weapon. It was his cage. And in that silence, Sarah stood taller than the chandeliers above her. The applause had barely settled when the whispering claws of resistance tried to claw their way back into the room. Power never surrenders without a fight. For every clap, there was a mutter. For every bowed head, there was a sneer. Clara Price leaned forward, her pearls rattling against the rim of her glass as she forced a thin smile. "So touching," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "But anyone can hold on to an old piece of paper. Real brilliance isn't in showing a signature. It's in proving you deserve it. Again." A murmur spread across the table like oil slicking water. "Yes, prove it," echoed Senator Brooks, though his voice lacked the bite it had earlier. He had clapped first, but his instinct to test remained. Nick Harper, ever the predator, adjusted his cufflinks and smirked. "One poem and a piece of paper don't make a scholar," he said, switching into Arabic as smoothly as a knife sliding from its sheath. "So answer me this. What of the new trade tariffs between 3 economic blocs? What of shipping lanes through the strait, rerouting, volatility spreads? Enlighten us, if you truly belong here." The challenge snapped through the air like a whip. It was the trap of the powerful. Flood the stage with jargon, turn brilliance into a gauntlet, dare the other to stumble. It wasn't just a question. It was a wall meant to remind Sarah of her place. Somewhere at the edge of the hall, Maya froze mid-step, the breadbasket trembling in her hands. Issa's knuckles whitened as she gripped her napkin, eyes fixed on Sarah. Even Ambassador Grant paused, her steel blue gaze sharp with quiet fury. Sarah did not rush. She did not falter. She tilted her head slightly, listening, her expression calm, as though sketching the labyrinth in her mind. Then, without raising her voice, she began. Still in Arabic, her words flowed like a clear map being drawn. Thra, routes matter, the Gulf to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean through transshipment ports, and the South Asia detour now under heightened risk. Insurance windows must be recalculated with demand elasticity under price shocks. Downstream logistics face second-order effects, particularly in vulnerable exchanges. And last quarter's volatility ban proves that the supposedly safe tariff policy actually worsens systemic sensitivity by forcing bottlenecked rerouting. She laid each argument like a stone, precise and immovable. Her cadence was steady, the logic airtight. When she reached the end, she rested her hands lightly on the tray, the way a mason might dust his palms after completing a wall. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was reverent. Dr. Thomas Hale, the gray-templed scholar who had studied Arabic his entire life, nearly dropped his fork. His lips parted, his eyes lit, as if he had just discovered a rare text. "Extraordinary," he whispered, first in awe, then louder so all could hear. "This is not mimicry. This is mastery. This is someone who has lived inside the language." The air shifted. Skeptics looked toward him, desperate for reassurance, and his authority sealed the verdict. Sarah wasn't parroting. She wasn't playing games. She was operating at a level even the experts bowed to. Senator Brooks, still flushed with whiskey, leaned back and let out a long exhale. Then slowly he began to clap again. 1, 2, then faster. "That's not just fluency," he said with sobered clarity. "That's expertise." The applause spread like fire through dry grass, swallowing hesitation in its path. The only ones who remained silent were those who knew their world had just shifted. Clara's smirk had dissolved into tight lips. Nick's confident sheen dulled as though the spotlight had turned on him instead, and Graham Ford, still silent, still rigid, looked as though the marble floor beneath him had cracked open. Sarah didn't bask. She let the silence return just long enough for the applause to sink into the walls, for the truth to etch itself into the marble. Then she said quietly but firmly, "I don't perform for your approval. I answer when I choose, and I have chosen tonight." The hall trembled. Not with noise, but with the weight of a new gravity. The applause had swelled, then ebbed, leaving in its wake a silence that felt charged, almost holy. Faces that once looked at Sarah with disdain now studied her as if she were something altogether unfamiliar, something they could neither dismiss nor own. Yet arrogance clung to the edges of the room like smoke. Clara adjusted her pearls with a trembling hand, unwilling to concede. Nick Harper tapped his phone under the table, already scheming how to twist this moment for his next broadcast. But it was Graham Ford's silence that loomed largest. He hadn't clapped, hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked for what felt like an eternity. His empire was built on language as a weapon, but tonight he'd been stripped of it, and Sarah wasn't finished. She stepped back half a pace, her tray steady in her hands, her gaze calm and unflinching. "Yes," she said, still in Arabic, but measured so even those who didn't understand felt the weight of her tone. "I am a server tonight, but I am also a student of Professor Yusuf Al-Hassan, linguistic advisor to the government." The words detonated like glass shattering against marble. Senator Brooks lurched upright, his bow tie crooked, his face flushed with disbelief. "Yusuf Al-Hassan?" His voice cracked. "I know him. I've read his papers. He advises entire governments. He only takes the best." Gasps rustled through the table like a windstorm. Ambassador Grant set her pen down deliberately, her steel blue gaze settling on Sarah as though reassessing the entire evening in a single breath. Dr. Hale leaned forward, his gray brows lifting, his scholar's heart thundering. "Al-Hassan," he murmured, almost reverently. Then her cadence, her grasp of classical form. "It makes sense. She's not merely fluent, she is trained." Even Issa, sitting at her father's side, froze, her hand tightening around her napkin. Her wide eyes glistened with something caught between shame and relief. It was as though Sarah had handed her a compass in a room that had spun her morality into knots. For the first time, the hierarchy of the room cracked. The microaggressions, the sneers, the shoe jokes, the clutch being pulled closer, all of it shrank against the towering presence of a truth no one could deny. Sarah wasn't just a waitress covering a shift. She wasn't a diversity quota or a charity case. She carried the seal of one of the most respected linguistic authorities in the world. Clara's voice, brittle as glass, broke the silence. But even so, she faltered under the weight of eyes turning toward her. Even so, she's still serving us drinks tonight. It was meant as a lifeline, but it only exposed the last desperate defense of prejudice. Sarah turned toward her calmly. Her voice was soft, yet every syllable carried like it had been carved into stone. Yes, I am serving you tonight, but I serve not only water, I serve words. And tonight, truth is being poured into this room whether you want it or not. The silence that followed was heavier than any applause. Faces flushed, gazes dropped, spines shifted uneasily in chairs. For the first time in that glittering hall, power did not rest with money, titles, or influence. It rested in the quiet dignity of a young woman in a black apron, her worn shoes planted firmly on the marble floor, her voice steady as the pillars holding up the chandeliers. And everyone in the room knew it. For a moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The clink of glasses had stopped. The strings in the corner faltered into silence. Even the air seemed unwilling to move. All eyes had turned, as if by some magnetic pull, toward Graham Ford. The ruthless billionaire, the man who made empires bow, now sat frozen under the gaze of a waitress who had turned the marble beneath his feet into a mirror. His jaw flexed once, twice, a muscle ticked at his temple. His trademark smile, the one sharpened in boardrooms, polished for cameras, wavered like a mask beginning to crack. He had built his empire on certainty, on wielding language as a scalpel and a sword. But here he was, cornered not by a rival, not by a government, but by a young black woman in a server's apron who had answered him in flawless Arabic and revealed ties to a man he could not belittle. The table shifted. Brooks coughed into his napkin, hiding his unease. Clara glanced down at her pearls, fiddling nervously. Nick Harper typed furiously under the table, his face half shadowed by the glow of his phone screen, already calculating how to spin this. And then there was Issa. His daughter sat at his side, her face pale but her eyes alight, fixed on her father as though she were seeing him for the first time. The arrogance, the mockery, the careless cruelty she had grown up around now clashed violently with the dignity standing across the table. Her breath came shallow, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. Shame swelled in her chest, but beneath it was something else, an ember of hope that Sarah's courage had lit. Finally, Graham leaned back, his chair groaning under the weight of the moment. He tried to summon his smile again, but it emerged thin, more like a grimace. His voice slid into English, low and cold. Poetry, signatures, teachers. Eloquence does not equal strength. He let his gaze sweep the tabs, desperate for allies. In the real world, power is not in words. It is in who controls the glass you drink from. It was meant to be a dismissal, a final blow to remind everyone of his stature, but the words fell flat. They no longer carried the same weight. Even the chandeliers seemed to cast their light away from him. Sarah did not flinch. She set her tray gently on the side table, her movements deliberate, like a conductor preparing to lift her baton again. Then she turned, her gaze steady, her voice calm enough to cut through the air like a blade of glass. "You misunderstand," she said softly, but every corner of the hall heard her. "Words are not decoration. They are power. And tonight, they no longer belong to you." The line landed with the force of a verdict. The guests shifted uncomfortably, each aware that something irreversible had occurred. Ambassador Grant's pen scratched once more across her notebook, a thin smile ghosting across her lips. Dr. Hale nodded, his scholar's heart pounding with recognition of a historic moment. Brooks swallowed hard, his earlier bravado shriveled into silence. Clara shifted in her chair, trying and failing to muster another cutting remark. And Issa turned fully toward her father now, her voice trembling but firm. She's right. The billionaire's mask slipped further, his eyes flickering toward his daughter as though betrayed. But in that instant, everyone at the table knew. The power had shifted. It was no longer his hall. It was hers. The room had shifted. No one dared to raise a glass or whisper a joke now. The chandeliers still blazed above, scattering light across the marble, but it no longer felt like Graham Ford's light. It was harsh, exposing, the kind of light that revealed cracks where people had once pretended everything was flawless. Sarah stood steady, her tray at her side, her shoulders squared as though she had always belonged at the center of this glittering hall. She had spoken with calm, dismantled arrogance with poetry, answered a trap with reason, and exposed Graham with nothing more than truth. And yet, she wasn't finished. The moment stretched thin as glass, trembling on the edge of breaking. Sarah slipped a hand into her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed against the folded edges of an envelope, its paper worn soft from years of being opened and closed, tucked away, and carried like a heartbeat. She drew it out, not with drama, but with reverence, as if she were holding a piece of her very life in her hands. A ripple of curiosity swept the table. Clara's pearls froze mid-twist. Nick Harper's phone lowered an inch. Ambassador Grant leaned forward just slightly, pen hovering above her notebook. Even Isa, wide-eyed and breathless, gripped the edge of the table as if bracing for an earthquake. Sarah unfolded the letter slowly, the dry rasp of paper loud in the silence. Then, in clear English, she began to read. Full honorary scholarship granted to Sarah Collins by the Royal Fellowship for Language and Culture. Board Chair, Graham Ford. The name struck the hall like a thunderclap. Heads turned instantly toward the billionaire. The chandeliers above seemed to blaze brighter, their crystal light catching the bold green ink of his signature as Sarah lifted the page for all to see. The words were undeniable, the flourish of his pen unmistakable. Graham Ford himself had once endorsed, at her brilliance, had placed his name beneath hers as validation. And yet here he sat, mocking her as a lowly creature unworthy of touching crystal. A gasp escaped Clara Price, her hand flying to her pearls as though they might shield her from the shame radiating off the revelation. Brooks nearly choked on his drink, his bow tie askew, his hands fumbling for stability. Dr. Hale's mouth fell open in awe, the words, "Oh my God," slipping from him before he caught himself. But it was Isa whose reaction cut deepest. She half rose from her chair, her face stricken, her lips trembling. She had watched her father sneer, laugh, and belittle, but now she saw in black and white, his own ink, his own hand, that he had once recognized Sarah's worth. The hypocrisy was unbearable. Her eyes glistened with tears that refused to fall. Graham's face flickered through a dozen emotions, defense, denial, calculation, fury, before collapsing into a mask of stone. But it was too late. The letter was out. His empire of words, his fortress of arrogance had been breached by his own hand. Sarah folded the paper neatly, tucking it back into the envelope as though the deed was done. Her voice was low, steady, almost gentle. "You signed many such letters," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "You may forget, but we do not." The hall cracked open. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rising like a storm breaking through the walls. Maya Lee clapped from the side, then Brooks, then Dr. Hale. The room thundered with recognition, respect, release. It was the sound of power shifting, the sound of truth finding its height. Isa stood fully now, her chair scraping back, and without hesitation she stepped around the table. The guests parted for her as though guided by instinct. She crossed the marble floor and stopped before Sarah, and then, in front of them all, Isa embraced her. Not a performance. Not a calculated gesture, just a daughter saying, "I'm sorry," with a trembling heart. In the corner, a voice tried to cling to the old order, muttering, "She's still serving us," but the words dropped to the floor like stones into a bottomless well. No one picked them up. The balance of the room had changed forever. Applause still echoed faintly against the marble when silence settled again, heavier than before. Graham Ford sat rigid, his once commanding frame dwarfed by the weight of his own signature. For decades he had turned words into weapons, laughter into daggers, arrogance into armor. But now, stripped by a single letter, he was exposed. His daughter still stood by Sarah, her arm resting lightly against the waitress's shoulder, the gesture unshakable in its sincerity. Issa's presence there was more damning than any accusation. It was loyalty shifting, a child choosing truth over blood. Graham tried to speak, his lips parting, but only a rasp escaped. He cleared his throat, forcing a smile that failed before it could even form. "This is a misunderstanding," he muttered, eyes darting between the faces at the table. "I sign many documents. One cannot be expected to remember the people whose lives they change." Ambassador Grant's voice cut through, crisp as steel. She set her pen down with a click that echoed louder than his excuses. "That is precisely what power demands, Mr. Ford. Memory." Clara Price squirmed in her seat, her pearls twisting so tight they squeaked. Nick Harper, ever the opportunist, had his phone angled discreetly, already filming snippets for a story he thought he could control. But even he looked uneasy. He had smelled blood earlier, but now the scent was his patron's. Senator Brooks, flushed from drink and shame, leaned forward, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "That's not just fluency, not just a scholarship. That's—" He hesitated, searching for the words, then landed softly on them. "That's real authority." His eyes flicked toward Sarah, not Graham. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She stood tall, letter back in her apron, her hands folded before her as though the applause and revelations were merely pauses in a longer shift. Her voice, calm and steady, reached across the hall. "Authority doesn't come from signatures alone. It comes from whether you honor them. You gave your word once. Tonight, you broke it with laughter." The truth landed harder than anger ever could. Graham's mask faltered again. For a heartbeat, the man behind the empire peeked through. The hollow exhaustion, the panic of someone realizing the walls he built were crumbling faster than he could repair them. He reached for his glass, his hand trembling slightly, but even the crystal betrayed him, the water inside rippling as if it too recoiled. Then came the final blow. Issa turned to her father, her voice quiet but strong. "You taught me that power was about control, but tonight I saw power in truth, and it didn't come from you." The words pierced deeper than any applause, deeper than any document. Graham's jaw clenched. His empire could weather lawsuits, market dips, even scandals. But this, the fracture between him and his daughter, witnessed by the world's eyes, was something no boardroom could fix. Dr. Hale broke the tension with a low murmur, half to himself, half to the room. "I've spent my life studying language, and tonight I saw it shift the ground beneath us. This is no longer his hall." He looked at Sarah. "It's yours." Applause stirred again, this time warmer, steadier. The sound wasn't celebration, it was recognition. Recognition that something irreversible had happened, that dignity had risen against arrogance and refused to bow. Sarah inclined her head slightly, the barest acknowledgement, then lifted her tray once more. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I serve water. I serve words. And tonight, I serve truth. Drink it as you will." The frickers. Froze, the words hanging in the air like crystal suspended in light. For the first time in his life, Graham Ford had no reply. The chandeliers still burned bright, but their brilliance felt different now. They no longer crowned Graham Ford's empire, they illuminated his unraveling. The marble floors reflected not his power, but his defeat, written in silence across every face in the hall. Graham remained seated, his once proud frame shrunken, as if the chair itself held him captive. His glass sat untouched, the rippling water stilled at last. For the first time in memory, he had nothing left to say. The applause subsided, but the echo lingered. It wasn't just noise, it was verdict. Sarah stepped back from the table, her movements calm, deliberate. She didn't bask in the victory. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, she adjusted a napkin at the corner of the table, her hand steady, her expression serene. Every gesture spoke louder than celebration. Dignity, requires no spotlight. And then it came, the final, shocking reveal. From the shadows of the room, a voice rose. It was Issa, still standing between her father and Sarah, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted a folded sheet of paper. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the hall like glass breaking. "This," she said, unfolding it slowly, "was in my father's desk drawer. I found it weeks ago. I didn't understand it then. I do now." The guest leaned forward, curiosity pricking the air. Graham's head shot up, panic flickering across his face. "Issa, no." His voice cracked, raw and stripped. But Issa didn't stop. She read aloud. "A directive to suppress certain scholarship approvals, specifically for candidates of color. Signature, Graham Ford." The words struck like a hammer. The hall gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that seemed to pull the chandeliers downward. Clara's pearls went slack against her chest. Brooks muttered a curse under his breath. Ambassador Grant's pen moved furiously, capturing every word. Sarah Saint oohed still, her face composed but her eyes blazing quietly. This was no longer a single insult, no longer a laugh at a glass. It was a pattern, a system laid bare, prejudice inked into policy. Graham lurched to his feet, his hands trembling. "That's private, misinterpreted." His words tumbled, desperate, but they landed on deaf ears. No one was listening anymore. It was Ambassador Grant who sealed the moment. She rose, her diplomatic pin gleaming under the light, and spoke with finality. "This is no longer an embarrassment, Mr. Ford. It is a record, and records cannot be laughed away." The weight of truth crushed the last defenses. Graham sank back into his chair, head bowed, his empire of arrogance scattered like shards of broken crystal. Issa lowered the paper, her eyes glistening but steady. She turned to Sarah, voice trembling. "I'm sorry for all of it." Sarah placed a hand over Issa's for just a heartbeat. Truth doesn't need apologies to stand, but it needs people willing to carry it forward. The hall was silent now, every guest holding their breath, aware they had witnessed the collapse of a man who thought himself untouchable, and the rise of a woman who had nothing but her words, her dignity, and her truth. Sarah turned, her tray balanced against her arm, and walked back into the rhythm of her shift. She poured water, adjusted silverware, made note of a gluten-free request. Every small action, every step, carried the weight of something far larger. And yet her voice lingered in the minds of all who had been present. The crystal glass does not lower the one who holds it. It only reflects the dignity of the one who drinks from it. By the time dessert was served, Sarah Collins was no longer just a waitress. She was a mirror in which the powerful had seen themselves and found their reflection unworthy.